Good afternoon, peers. Today we're going to go over Chapter 5, Perception, in the Skinner book. My name is Adam Tinsley. Perceiver or receiver. Key points. Perceivers are organisms in which act upon their environments. The initiating action is taken by the perceiver. Guiding question. Do we act upon our environment? Example. Does vision result in the production of an image? Receiver. The initiating action is taken by the environment. Guiding question. Do our environments act upon us? Example. Does an image from the outer world strike the retina and activate the process called vision? Skinner postulates that through an operant analysis, the environment is independent of the body, and therefore environments act upon the organisms. Organisms are in turn receivers. Second subheading, stimuli control of operant behavior. Key point. A being is subject to the three-term contingency as it relates to its environment. Therefore, the environment influences an organism before and after it responds. The stimuli present at the time when a response is reinforced gains control over the response. I repeat, a stimuli present at the time when a response is reinforced gains control over the response. This makes the probability of the response more likely to occur when that stimuli is presented. Stimuli control of operant behavior continue. If a response is reinforced only when a particular property is present, then the property attains exclusive control to the response through a process called discrimination. An example, Pavlov's dogs. The unconditioned stimulus, or the stimulus, was the bell, which elicited the salivatory response in the dog. If you change that stimulus to a trumpet being played, as opposed to the tone of the bell, so the tone of the trumpet versus the tone of the bell, the dog would discriminate that the tone of the trumpet is not what is going to end up with the consequence of the dog being fed. Therefore, the dog is going to discriminate between the tone and the bell, and it's only going to salivate when the tone of the bell is presented. Going back to the presentation, ontogeny plays a major role in an organism's response. Additionally, contingencies to which the organism has been exposed determines what they will perceive. This is a reoccurring theme throughout the chapter. Conditions affecting what is seen. Key point. Condition number 1. Skinner begins this section with relating stimulus control and operant behavior to contingencies of reinforcement. Consequences of reinforcement. We respond to our environment in ways related to our personal history and genetic endowment. In other words, we respond to environments in different ways because of what has happened previously when we came into contact with it. Example, 2 people are in a car driving to the same place. One is a driver, one is a passenger. The driver drives the car from one place to another. The driver is more likely to be familiar with the route and be able to navigate that route better or be more familiar than that of the passenger, due to the fact that the driver directly interacts with that route, and so interacts with that environment. So that's an example of a condition affecting what's seen. The passenger is going to see that route a lot differently than the person who is actually interacting with the route. Conditions affecting what is seen continue. Condition number 2. When a stimulus is weak or unclear, it is often clear that other factors are affecting the likelihood that a person will see a thing in a given way. Example: a slight noise is heard as a burglar or a mouse by those who will respond vigorously to burglars or mice. Consider: has this person heard slight noises in the past, and was it a burglar or a mouse? That's going to affect that response of that person, or it's going to affect how that individual sees what is going on. Condition number 3. Level of deprivation makes a difference in what is perceived. Example: a person might mistake a noise for a telephone if they are awaiting an important phone call. If I have not had enough stimuli or enough telephone calls, then I might be more likely to respond to the first noise I hear as a telephone when the noise is actually something else. Experience versus reality. Key points. Skinner takes a metaphysical approach to stimuli that can't always be described in strictly physical terms. Skinner also recognizes that behaviorism is said not to account for how a person experiences, interprets, or assigns meaning to a situation. Skinner believes that to account for a person's experience, one has to examine their behavior with respect to that experience. The only way to account for a person's experience is to take into account a person's genetic and environmental history. Again, ontogeny. The important differences in how people experience reality is through how they behave or respond to their experience. People's behavior only differs when differences in their past contingencies exist. So the way they have been reinforced by those situations are going to determine their behaviors. If those ways that they're being reinforced differ, then their behavior or their responses to those differences are going to exist, or differences in their responses are going to exist if they've been reinforced differently. Key points of the copy theory. This is a theory of perception in which it is posited one never sees the world itself, and contends that we only interact with copies because the world is filtered through our senses. So the world exists outside of our body, but when we perceive the world, it is filtered through our senses, and we don't actually see the world as it is. We see a copy which is maintained inside of our body. Skinner asserts that copy theory is most plausible if the argument is made in relation to visual stimuli only. When it comes to our other senses and the ways that one perceives the world, then copy theory, in Skinner's view, is less convincing. The ultimate conclusion with regard to copy theory is that the environment is and always has been outside of the human body, and that a stimulus present when a response is reinforced acquires some control over the response, meaning that to appropriately consider copy theory, one has to examine the contingencies responsible for stimulus control. Seeing in the absence of the thing seen. Key point. This section on perception deals with the relevance of dreams, fantasy, and imagination in behaviorism. Skinner describes these processes in the spirit of reinforcement. Hence, if we are reinforced by seeing a place, Venice in the example that Skinner uses, we are more likely to engage in that behavior, which is the behavior of seeing a place, Venice in the example Skinner uses, in our memory or imagination. This process can even take place when there is very little in the immediate setting which resembles the place that we imagine. Conclusion: seeing does not require a thing being seen. You do not have to see a place in your immediate environment in order to see a thing or a place. mind and stimulus control. Key points. This final section in the chapter in perception deals with the meaning of the word mind and the way that in the English language it is often used in various parts of speech. That is not necessarily the main point. Skinner seems to settle on the definition of the mind as a place in which things are perceived, but only through the reporting of stimuli, not sensations or perceptions. There is a review of the type of perceptions and self-knowledge that can be accessed in the mind. Skinner asserts that if there are no copies of things inside of our bodies at any time, then perception relies heavily on the act of seeing. Perception can also be mediated through tangible interactions. Dreams are not reliable perceptions because the conditions for self-observation cannot be met. One can recognize something that they have cognized in the past. And the conclusion in this section and the chapter is, once one investigates the consequences or contingencies that control their behavior, self-knowledge about the stimuli that control those contingencies becomes available. And that concludes our discussion of Chapter 5, Perception, in the Skinner book.